here we go, our next installment, and if you know, you know. And I want to go back to the character that we have been referencing this entire series. His name was Peter. And Peter was well acquainted with something that you and I are well acquainted with as well. It's this: failure. Pete knew what it was like to fail over and over and over again. He failed with the words that he used. He failed when it was the emotional responses that he used. He once grabbed a knife out of his pocket and cut a dude's ear off because the guy made him mad. You're packing, bro? That's your response? To cut people's ears off? Come on, Peter. You better than that. And the reality is that there are moments in our lives where we would look back and go, I failed with what I said. I failed with how I reacted. I failed with who I allowed myself to become in these moments as well. But I want to encourage you with this, that failure is never fatal unless you choose that failure is final. You're not a failure. At some point, all of us are going to fail. All of us have failed. Scripture is very clear on this when it says that all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. If this is the case, then it indicates that all of us are well acquainted with failure. I would even argue that all of us are more well acquainted with failure than we are with success. This is why the rubber meets the road here, and we're climbing the mountain to look at failure and go, I will not identify myself by my failures. I will identify myself by who God calls me. What does he call you? One of his kids, his greatest creation, loved, cared for, attended to, seen, heard, and he's always present with us. Oftentimes, the difference between you seeing failure as being final and you seeing failure as being temporary is your ability to receive God's forgiveness from the failure that you've experienced. Like the difficult relationship that, you put yourself in some of those compromising situations. Or maybe the moment where your parents asked you to do something and your response was just not honoring. Or maybe the failure was that you really thought that you would make that team, or you really thought that you'd pull an A off in that class and you ended with a D, or you didn't make the team. Whatever the failure is, let's just all be clear that there are moments where we identify ourselves by our failures, and sometimes we dive really deep within ourselves with guilt, shame, discouragement, and despair. But can I encourage you with this? That if Jesus shows back up and forgives Peter, we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. Jesus shows up and says, hey, I know what you've done. I know where you've failed, but I will not quit on you, Peter. If Jesus felt that way about Peter, I just want you to know he feels the same about you as well. So closing question I got for you, what's an area where you failed and you're struggling to accept Jesus' forgiveness and forgive yourself as a result? Write it down. Talk about it. And then choose to pray a prayer and say, Jesus, I lift my life to you and say, I receive your forgiveness, and I choose not to live believing I'm a failure anymore. You don't see me that way, so I choose not to see myself that way. Failure is only fatal if you choose that it's final. If you know,